Why do we seem to have a double standard when it comes to Israel and the Middle East? When you talk about morality, morality is as a distinction between right and wrong, between absolutes. The West was given the choice: do you choose civilization or barbarism? And so far, they've not chosen civilization.
Melanie Phillips, it's a delight to be with you. You and I both have the privilege of living in Jerusalem, not all that far from each other. We occasionally bump into each other at cafes for breakfast and that and the other. But here we're talking today about really an extraordinary accomplishment of yours, your just published book, The Builder's Stone: How Jews and Christians Built the West and Why Only They Can Save It. It's published by Wicked Sun in the United States. It's a fabulous read. It's a challenging read, and I'm delighted that we're going to have this opportunity now to talk about at least a few of the ideas that you lay out in it.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to speak to you.
We're going to come to the book shortly, but my impression is that in the last year or two, you've become much better known in American audiences than has been the case ever before. And so while some of your British followers and Israeli followers may know a little bit about your background, I think it's less true of the Americans. And the positions that you articulate in the book now are not the positions that Melanie Phillips would have been articulating had she written a book about the same issues 30 years ago, let's just say. So maybe we could start with just telling people a bit about your intellectual life's journey.
Indeed. Well, I was brought up in a fairly typical British Jewish family, and I thought of myself as a liberal, by which I mean not liberal in the sense that the Americans tend to use the term, which means like left wing. Liberal in the traditional British sense, which means committed to tolerance and things like that. And I worked for the best part of 20 years for the Guardian newspaper, which is a bit like the New York Times / Haaretz on speed. And I thought that we were all on the same page because the Guardian had a tradition of being a liberal, in the British sense, newspaper. But in fact, it had become very left-wing, which is actually different. And I came up against this at the beginning. I came up against this in 1982. When for the first time I realized that there was a problem in Britain, on the left, and in The Guardian about Israel. That was when Israel was enmeshed in the very difficult war in Lebanon. I didn't take a great deal of interest in that war at the time. I was a very different person then. I had never been to Israel and never wanted to go. Another story. But I was aware that Israel was in Lebanon for defensive purposes, because it wanted to rid once and for all Lebanon and itself of the scourge of the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was encamped in Lebanon. And Israel had got itself mired in the morass of that war. It may have been an unwise war, but that wasn't the point. Out of the woodwork in Britain came suddenly the image of the Jew as Nazi. It was the first time I'd heard it. I was very deeply shocked. And long story short, out of the woodwork came old-fashioned, unvarnished anti-Semitism. It was a kind of precursor of what we've been living through since October 7, 2023. But it was milder, but it felt pretty bad at the time. And during that time, I was made to feel, in fairly explicit terms at The Guardian, that there was a line over which I had crossed by expressing my concern for truth and justice when it came to Israel. And there was one particular exchange that I had. I was a senior journalist. I was an editorial writer at the paper. And there was one particularly very, very instructive exchange in which I said to my colleagues, why do we seem to have a double standard when it comes to Israel and the Middle East? Here you have President Assad, the father of the recently deposed Assad, who has caused the death over the course of, 2 or 3 weeks it was, of his enemies in the Muslim Brotherhood, who I think were something between 10 and 40,000. And it's a regular news story on the foreign pages. It's no big deal. Whereas Israel, in a defensive war in Lebanon, if it kills any Palestinians, it's a front page splash story. There's an outraged editorial. There are furious op-eds. We seem to have a double standard. I said in all innocence. It was a different time. I was a different person. And I was astounded by the reply.
Which was?
The reply was, of course there's a double standard. I mean, we in the West, and we include you in this, and I realized I had, at that moment, become not we, but you. We assume that you are the same as us, and we in the West are brought up to believe in things like the respect for every person and the dignity of every human being, and human rights and all that. And that's how we live, and we judge ourselves and we judge you by that standard, you. But when it comes to the developing world, they're not brought up like that. They're not brought up to have any respect for human life. So we can't judge what they do by our standards. That's racism. And I said, what are you telling me? That if one is unfortunate enough to be born in the developing world, one is not then entitled to the same expectations of life and liberty that we are? To me, that's racism. And then they said, why are you so upset? You tell us that you are morally superior to us. So why are you so upset by this? And at that point, I realized there was a problem. Until that point, I thought that we were all on the same page. I had certain beliefs, and I have those identical beliefs today. What were those beliefs? Those ideals. They were a belief in truth rather than lies, justice rather than injustice, a belief that one should stand up to abuses of power wherever they were committed, a belief that one should look after the vulnerable and protect the vulnerable, a belief in compassion, and all good things like that. And I thought they were on the same page as me. And I realized at that moment that they were on a completely different, in fact, the opposite page. And what then happened over many, many years, I stayed at The Guardian for many years, it was a bit like, you wake up one day and you find your family has been abusing you, and you find that life is never the same again. You can't really live with them, but you can't live without them because you're the overall family. It's very difficult to separate. Eventually I separated. But during that time, before I did, having had a kind of jolt to my system, political and moral system, I went through virtually every issue you can think of: education, family life, the nation, multiculturalism. And on every one of those issues, I took a position which was diametrically opposite to the position of the left. And as a result, I was, to put it in the terms of today, multiply cancelled. And sent into a kind of internal exile before I left The Guardian completely. And that's how it's been really ever since, except it's got much worse, because everything's got much worse and much more exaggerated and extreme. But I remain committed to those ideals, and I have become ever more convinced that the people that I once thought were on my side are not only on the other side, not only wrong, but actually have done untold damage to the society we're living in.
So the journey, in a certain way, is the journey of the world, not the journey of Melanie Phillips, because Melanie Phillips is right where she was in 1982, but by the time we get to 2025, the world has changed dramatically, and that's really the focus of the book. You have a very hard-edged, cutting, I think, incredibly insightful critique of much of what has happened in the West, and as we'll talk about a little bit later, you actually see the Western world, and particularly Judaism and its contributions to the Western world, as part of the potential fix. Now, we could spend our entire conversation talking about what's wrong with the West, which we're not going to do, because I want to get to the fix, and I want to talk about Israel, and I want to talk about Israel post-October 7th, where we've learned some very important things about the nation state, the Jewish nation state, the Jewish people, so we'll come back to all of that. But give us the rough outlines of what's the diagnosis, Melanie Phillips' diagnosis of what's gone wrong with the left. 1980s, the early 1980s that you were talking about, were obviously a transitional point in American Jewish life also. Sabra and Shatila particularly is the first major moment in which you see major American Jewish organizations struggling very hard with how to embrace Zionism and what they called their moral values. And Sabra and Shatila was a very problematic event, no matter what part of the political spectrum one is on. So it was a difficult time in Britain, and for you and the garden and your place in the garden. And it's also earthquake, seismic shift kind of time elsewhere. But things have changed a tremendous amount. We're not talking about the 1982 issues anymore, or at least not, they've developed tremendously. So now, 40-something years later, what's gone wrong with the West? What do you see, and what caused it?
Well, the first thing to say is that I have come to realize that the attack on Israel and the Jewish people is intimately related to what I think has gone wrong with the West. The second thing is that you talk about the 1980s, which is when it all became kind of noticeable for the first time, to me anyway. But looking back, it goes back much further than that. Now, how far does I want to take it back? I could take it back to the Enlightenment in the 18th century, but perhaps I won't do that. I would like to start my kind of thought process of this unraveling at the Second World War, because I think that the rise of Nazism and the Holocaust had a profound effect on the West, a profoundly demoralizing effect on the West. And
even though the West won.
Even though the West won. The effect was demoralizing because even though Nazism had been defeated by the West, and it took them a very long time to wake up to it, they were busily appeasing it for a very long time, but even though they defeated it, the fact is it happened not in some benighted backwater of the world, but at the very apex of Western civilization. Germany was, the cultural avatar of everything good about the West. And the Nazis themselves were highly cultured people. We've all heard and seen accounts of these terrible mental pictures we have of people going to the gas chambers to the strains of Mozart. So I think this had a very profound effect, that people said, kind of in themselves, this is what we did. This is what modernity did. And out of that came, in fact, a number of people who said that in terms. They were left-wing revolutionaries. They came out of Europe and they went to America. Some of them were called the Frankfurt School. And they basically said, we did this. Modernity did this. The West did this. Therefore, there's something fundamentally rotten about the West and modernity. And we have to make a new world. And on the back of that, they produced what was basically a kind of Marxist-based critique of the world, which set in train really everything that we're living through, all the ideologies that threw up in the air the settled moral and political understandings that the West had been based on. And that went very deep. When it comes to Britain, and I think Britain was a kind of leader of all of this, Britain was in a particularly paradoxical position. Britain had stood alone in 1940 against the Nazi menace. Without Britain, the war would not have been won. Britain had a heroic past, a heroic role in this. However, Britain emerged the victor, along with America, but Britain was bankrupt and in hock to America. And the intelligentsia looked at itself and looked at the country and said, we can't manage anymore. And at the same time, the British Empire was collapsing. So we have nothing, said the British. And they became, I think, fundamentally demoralized. I think that demoralization led them to join the European Union, as it then wasn't the precursor to the European Union, later on. But I think in that state of demoralization, the elites, the intelligentsia, were very open to ideas which, in another world, they would have thrown out. Ideas which basically said we have to make a new world. That was kind of the beginning of a political process. At the same time, I think that, again, particularly in Britain, which was a kind of leader of this, religion was going down the pan. Christianity was going down the pan. The church was basically collapsing. Even then, it had started its collapse, you could say, at the turn of the 20th century. I think further blows were delivered to the church's idea of goodness in the world and of of optimism and of God in the world by the terrible slaughter of the First World War, and then the disaster of Nazism and the Holocaust, in which the church felt complicit. And a whole lot of other things were going on in the church's mind, and it basically ceased being an institution that was capable of giving any kind of spiritual or moral direction. And it turned itself into, at home, a kind of committed to what we call today social justice, and abroad it got itself hooked to what then developed as a result of this Marxist-based thinking. It came out of the World Council of Churches, a commitment to what was called liberation theology, which is basically Marxism. And so Christianity, in the Protestant churches anyway, became a form of social and political activism. And this all of it conspired to basically take a wrecking ball to every single fundamental moral and social and cultural principle on which the West was based.
So now let me just come back for a second. You begin the book, actually, towards the beginning of the book, talking about the march towards populism in certain parts of the world, and you acknowledge, I think quite rightly, that it's a result in large measure of the failure of liberalism. And one could ask, why did liberalism fail? And there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of them has to do with the fracture of some of the institutions that were critically important for producing citizens of liberal societies. So you pointed to the church or the synagogue, and the synagogue has a slightly different history, but it absorbed some of the same blows over the course of time, especially in the United States. Sure. The nuclear family was also an institution that was critical in raising the kinds of human beings who would then be the mainstay of liberal societies. And schools. Education. Schools, high schools, universities, and so on and so forth. So the church or synagogue, the religious world, the familial world, and the educational/intellectual world all suffer huge blows. They both suffer them and they cause them at the same time in the 60s, 70s, 80s. So now let's fast forward, if we can, just to make sure that we can talk about post-October 7th and Israel and so forth. The church, the family, the university, they've all collapsed in certain ways. They are not the institutions that they were when you were working at The Guardian and had these first interactions in the 1980s. They're entirely different. So what has that all led to now? Where are we? What are we? We look out the window of our home at the world, so to speak, and what are you seeing that is completely dysfunctional now?
What I'm seeing is where we've got to from this process, which has accelerated and become exaggerated and has taken different pathways. What I see is a complete erosion of what we once called conscience, a complete erosion of a moral sense which distinguishes between right and wrong, truth and lies, justice and injustice, victim and victimizer. We're in a world now where the idea of objective truth is seen as evidence. If you believe in objective truth, you are seen as a credulous fool, an uneducated and unsophisticated fool, because everybody knows, as Oprah said famously, we have my truth and your truth. Everything is relative. Everything is a matter of opinion. Evidence and facts have gone out the window. What matters is feelings. What I feel is much more important than what you say is. What I feel is. How I live is entirely a matter for me, and nobody can tell me that my lifestyle is any worse than yours. You cannot tell me that. Nobody can tell me that my culture is better or worse than anyone else's. Nobody can tell me, as somebody who lives in the West, that belief in freedom of speech, equality for women, freedom of religion, all those things that we associate with the West are better than the alternative. Really? Oh yes, really. That's what we've all told ourselves. And so it's been impossible to hold the line for Western values. Now, in all that, in throwing all that out, we have thrown out, this idea of objective truth. If there's no such thing as truth, there's no such thing as reason. You can't have rationality if you've got no truth. We're living in a world in which it's been turned upside down. Language has been hijacked, with words coming to mean the opposite of what they actually should mean. And morality itself has been rewritten completely so that people no longer understand. In fact, if you talk to many young people, it is appalling to me that they're absolutely baffled when you talk about morality on the basis that what morality is a distinction between right and wrong, between absolutes. Morality is all about taking responsibility for what I do, accepting the consequences of what I do. On the contrary, morality is simply about the consequences. So, for example, come back to Israel. To the modern amoral, post-moral, post-religious mind, the only thing that matters is dead Palestinian Arabs. If you say to them, well, they're dead because they've been killed because Hamas used them as human shields. They're killed by Israeli ordnance because the Israelis have to do this to protect themselves and defend themselves because they are under attack and because the Hamas started this. The Hamas are the aggressors. Israel is the victim. In a just war, which is what this is, people have to, unfortunately, sometimes go to war to prevent the innocent, more of the innocent, being killed. And in a just war, unfortunately, there are innocents on the other side being killed. But in order to prevent the bigger horror, which is, in this case, attempted genocide, one has to have a just war. None of that washes because the only thing that matters is dead Palestinian Arabs. The idea that people behave in a way for which they have to pay a price, that they must take responsibility for that there is a difference between aggression and defense, no.
Why? Why do they care about dead Palestinian Arabs, which you and I both do also? Neither of us take any pleasure in those horrible sights. Why do they care about that, but they don't care about the victims of the Otef, of the Gaza envelope? Why do they care about that, but they don't care about how many people the United States killed in Mosul, or how many innocent Germans the Allies killed during the Second World War? Why has the Palestinian victim become sort of a different category unto itself?
Well, I think there are many reasons for that. Partly it's what I've just been saying, that what matters is that these people are wretched and poor and defenseless because...
So it's the oppressor-oppressed binary?
Yes, it's the oppressor-oppressed binary. Because Israel has the weaponry it has, and because it's backed by America, then according to this, what I would say is a Marxist-based distinction between the powerful and the powerless, Israel has the power, therefore, as a powerful entity, it can never be in the right. And the Palestinian Arabs are powerless because they don't have these weapons, and therefore, as a powerless entity, they can never be in the wrong. So the idea that the Palestinian Arabs actually are trying to commit genocide, don't be ridiculous, it's the Israelis who are committing genocide. That's the first thing. The second thing, which is, I think, an even harder thing to swallow, is that this kind of person in the West does not recognize Israeli victims because Israeli victims, or rather Jewish victims, get in the way of the narrative. The narrative is one of Israeli power and oppression, Palestinian Arab powerlessness and victimization. And if you have a situation as you had on October 7, where you have the powerless Palestinian Arabs behaving not just in a murderous, but in a depraved and barbaric fashion, that cannot have happened. It simply cannot have happened. And then there's a third point, which is even worse, an even more difficult point, I think, for us to internalize, because it's so horrible, which is that the idea of the Jewish victim just has to be written out completely, because people cannot deal and do not want to deal with the Jew as victim, because to them Jews in the world are all powerful, not just Israel. Jews in the world are all powerful. And Jews in the world are a nuisance. Jews in the world mean conscience. Conscience gets in the way of what I want to do, I as a Western person. And consequently, you have to sort of get rid of all this. And also, conscience brings guilt. And when we look at the Jews as the West, when we look at the Jews, we have guilt. Okay, we weren't Nazis, but we were the West, and the West did this to them, and we can't cope with that. We cannot cope as the West with what we did to them. So we have to make it okay in our minds. So they cannot be victims ever. They can only be powerful.
And we're going to analogize them to Nazis. So we're going to somehow
so
undo the guilt.
Once you analogize them to Nazis, then we're free.
Right.
We are free. And to me, you know, we all saw this extraordinary monstrosity over and over again after October 7, where you had the pictures of the posters with the faces of the hostages displayed in streets around the West. And you had people tearing them down.
Including Jews on the Upper West Side, by the way.
What, tearing them down?
Yeah.
Okay, so they were tearing them down. And they were put up again, and they tore them down. And we saw them, some of them actually were videoed. And I looked at their faces, and it was an astonishing thing, because they weren't just tearing them down. Their faces were convulsed by rage. And if they were stopped, you saw this unbelievable rage. Why were they so enraged by the pictures of innocent women, children, babies, and men? Why were they so enraged? And I've thought a lot about this, and I put this in the book, and I kept coming back to it, because it seemed to me something else was going on other than just hatred of Israel, other than compassion for the Palestinians, not that I think there is any, but anyway, among these people, something else was going on to explain this rage. When they were tearing down these posters, they were tearing down the Jews out of their sight, out of their heads, out of their conscience, out of the world. They wanted the Jews torn out of their world. And I think that is why fundamentally, this is why this kind of person cannot accept Jewish victims, because they can't deal with it on a whole number of levels. It gets in the way of the narrative that they've constructed about the Middle East. Why have they constructed that narrative? Because they can't deal with Jewish victimization. They cannot deal with the fact that what the Jews of Israel have, what the Jews of pre-Israel and of Israel have been putting up with for the last 100 years. It's 100 years of basically warfare against them to exterminate the Jewish homeland. They can't deal with that. They can't deal with the fact that this is a process of extermination that's going on, and they can't deal with the fact that Jews are to them they're all present in their world. They're all present as bad things, as conscience, as stopping me doing what I want to do, as being powerful. All those things, they want us gone.
Ironically, though, you say, and I thought it was a very compelling part of the book, that they want us gone. They rip the posters down with a kind of almost looks like an exorcism of some sort.
Exactly.
But we're the solution also,
yes.
You argue, which is,
yes.
I think, a fascinating twist in
That's
the book.
right.
In other words, they want us gone because we reminded them so much they don't want to think about. It's a long history. It's thousands of years old in certain ways. But you actually argue that after you go through this long analysis, which is fascinating, of all of the many ills that we see in Western society, of which we've covered only really very few in our conversation of necessity, you actually argue that Jews and Israel are part of the solution here. And that's going to strike many readers as counterintuitive in a certain way. So explain that to us. Why, in the response to this erosion of the qualities of the West, are Jews, you say the Christians also, but I think the interesting part of the book is really, especially when you get to the Jews, and Israel, we're the solution. Why? How?
Well, let me come back to something you mentioned en passant a few minutes ago, which is that we've been talking about the pathology of the West. But there are millions and millions of people in the West who are not signed up to this pathology at all and are horrified by what they see happening to the West, beyond horrified. And in fact, it's taking the form of populist movements, the election of Donald Trump for the second time, various so-called populist leaders coming up in Europe. Britain has kind of bucked the trend because it elected an old-fashioned kind of statist, rather Stalinist Labour government, but nevertheless it has Nigel Farage and his Reform Party, who are the populist party, snapping at their heels. So you have this great movement taking different forms in different countries of people, millions and millions of people who basically don't want the West to die. And so you have there, a situation in which is not all lost. On the contrary, I think that the people who are the problem, unfortunately, run the entire show. But in numerical terms, they're not that many. I mean, there are a lot, but there are millions who oppose them. So we have to park that for a moment as a source of some optimism. But the thing that you're getting at is the kind of values of Judaism that can come to the rescue, if only people would realize it. The reason why the West has turned on itself, and the reason why the West has turned on the Jews to the extent it has, I'll start that again. The reason why the West has turned on the Jews in the way that it has is because the West has turned on itself. In turning on itself, it has turned against its fundamental building block values. Everyone thinks that those values were Christianity. Well, yes, they were. That is the foundational religious creed that made the West what it is. But Christianity rests on Judaism, something that Christianity doesn't like to talk about, and something that nobody else even thinks about.
Though the American founding fathers, to their credit, who were faith-filled Christians, were very open about the debt they had to do.
They did indeed. Now, the point is this, that it's not just that the Jews gave the West all its great qualities, such as putting others above yourself so that you form a community, looking after others, conscience, personal responsibility that makes a functioning society, justice, rule of law based in the consent of the people, which actually is the foundation of democracy, limited government, which it wasn't democracy as we know it today, but limited government and the rule of law, which are the building blocks of democracy. This is in the Hebrew Bible. And okay, Christianity, embedded these values into the West, but they come from Judaism. So in turning on itself in the way that it has, the West has turned on its Jewish foundational values. Now, if the West wants to get back to what it was, if the West wants to recover and survive, it has to reconnect to those Jewish values. Now, how does it do that? Well, here again, Jews as a people have a great deal to offer, because the thing that the Jewish people do and have done ever since they got going is that the Jews have survived. They have survived attempts to get rid of them, to exterminate them, and pressures of assimilation that would have knocked out any other culture or creed or country. And they haven't. They have survived. Not only that, they have outlived every single culture that has tried to get rid of them. How can this possibly be? And so you have to look, which I've tried to do in the book, at why did the Jews survive? What is their special sauce? What is their recipe for survival? And can the West learn from that? And I believe absolutely it can. There are mechanisms that the Jews have used which the West has either forgotten or never put into practice. The tremendous emphasis, for example, in Judaism on the transmission of the culture, not just through education, which is a kind of sacred duty in Judaism, but also through memorializing events of the past in the Jewish calendar, which keep the history alive.
It's a national memory, actually, unlike other religious calendars, which are more personal.
Exactly. I mean, the Jews have ensured they have a future because they have retained their connection to the past. And the other thing is this, intimately connected to this, that the Jews have always understood they are a nation. And the cultural survival is as a nation. Their memory is as a nation, not the religion, a nation. The religion is a very important part of the nation, but is a nation. Now, when you look at the travails of the West, what the West has told itself is that the nation, the Western nation, is itself a problem. That the Western nation is a cause of strife, of prejudice, of war. If only there wasn't a Western nation, there would be no more war, there would be no more prejudice, there would
John
be
Lennon,
no more
as you
hatred.
point out in the book.
John Lennon's Imagine come to life. And the result is that, of course, it's collapsing, because only the nation can protect the values and principles that the West or any culture holds dear. I think this is also a reason why Israel is hated so much. Israel is a nation. It understands itself to be a nation. It understands the importance of the nation. And, you know, when you look at what's happened in this last terrible year, since the October 7 pogrom, you see all these amazing young people going to war in a spirit which has astounded everybody in Israel and would astound everybody in the world were they ever to pay attention. Right. Because they've gone to war in a spirit not just, oh yes, we have to go to war to make sure that Israel isn't destroyed, which is enough of a reason, but they've gone to war with another thing in their hearts, which is that we are going to war to uphold and defend our culture, our history, our identity. We have behind us the generations that came before us who have died and fought and lived and organized themselves to keep this Jewish nation alive in perpetuity, and we have a duty to do that. Why? Because we have a duty to the past, because we want a future. We have a duty to the past in order to keep our nation alive, because we love our nation. We love what it stands for, because we understand what it stands for is good, because we have taught ourselves that it is good, because it is good. And we want to teach our children that it's good, and we want our children and their children to grow up in this good society committed to these good things. That's why Israel is succeeding in a way that the West is not. That's why Israel is determined to live, while the West seems to have a death wish. Now, if the West wants to survive, and there are millions in the West who want it to survive, they have to start listening to the Jewish people. The Jewish people do cultural survival as their unique selling point. So it would make sense, if you want your culture to survive, to say, maybe we can learn from the Jewish people. And guess what? They gave us our foundational values, which made us great all those centuries ago. So it's like a no-brainer. Instead, we're seeing what we're seeing, that the West is turning on the Jews and it's turning on Israel. This is a madness. It really is a madness, because it's a self-destructive madness. So what I've tried to do in the book is to say, here's a strange thing. People don't realize the extent to which Judaism, the principles of Judaism, the motor of Judaism was intimately connected, not just with the West in a kind of broad sense of, you know, it was behind Christianity which created all these great things, but you mention America. You look at America, the founding fathers, you know, they built America on these principles, and people indeed even less know about this. The British Crown, which is the focal point, the fulcrum of the unity of the United Kingdom, the British Crown was patterned on the Davidic monarchy, just as the founding fathers saw the same things. What did they see? What did they see? They saw a pattern that had been established, which they wanted, a pattern which brought people together. It brought together otherwise warring tribes and united them. How did it unite them? It united them in the belief that they were all in it together, that they weren't put down by some despotic ruler, but that they were going to be ruled by the law laid down in accordance with the consent of the people, and that their king or queen was a limited monarchy. And that was patterned on the Davidic principle that there was no earthly absolute ruler, that the kings of ancient Israel had a king above them, which was God. But the kings, in a kind of pragmatic sense, were constrained by the judges, the prophets. So it was a pattern of a limited monarchy. All these wonderful things, which were absolutely essential to Western democracy, Western freedom, as it then developed, were enshrined in the British Crown and in the Founding Fathers' conception of America. And so it's a no-brainer. You have to find a way of restoring that. Now, I'm not minimizing the difficulties for a moment. And much of this, as I say in the book, there's an elephant in the room here, and the elephant in the room is religion. I don't believe that one can get back to this without reaffirming a religious sense. Now, especially in Britain, godless Britain, where, religious belief is regarded as a kind of species of insanity. I mean, it's not the same in America, but nevertheless, you get what I'm saying. We're living in a kind of increasingly post-religious, very secular world. So people will say, well, this is complete nonsense. I mean, you can't possibly go back to that. I mean, you're being Canute. You're turning back the tide of secularism. Well, maybe. But look at what we've got instead. We've got rid of religion because we're so rational in the West. What have we got? Witchcraft is the fastest growing creed. Witchcraft. Paganism. People are worshipping inert objects. We're not any more rational. And look at the effect. People say, religion is such a constraint. It makes us all miserable. Really? Look at what's happened. Record amounts of terrible distress among particularly young people, psychological disorders. Basically, all of them, or not all of them, I exaggerate, but many of them, you can trace back to the same kind of root, which is that young people are disanchored. Right. They have no meaning in their lives. They have no purpose in their lives. They're desperately trying to find purpose, desperately, but it's never enough. And I think this is where religion, properly taught, comes in. Again, Judaism has a lot to teach. Judaism does not regard religion as, basically a communion between the individual and the Almighty in a church or a synagogue or anything like that. It's about how we live in the here and now. It's how we make the best of ourselves in this world, how we make a better world for each other, about giving meaning to our lives, about meeting challenges which give us purpose to our lives. Believe it or not, challenges which the West has tried to remove from everybody on the basis that if you have a challenge, you might fail the challenge, and then you'll have a nervous breakdown, and you'll be triggered. On the contrary, Judaism believes that only through challenges to yourself, which you may fail, you have a sense of purpose and meaning, which makes you not happy, but satisfied, content, fulfilled. Aren't these good things? So, Judaism has a great deal to teach of a pragmatic nature. All these things are there for the taking, if only the West would see it. That's why I've written the book.
So this notion that Judaism is something that needs to be recovered, re-embraced, so that it can save the West, brings me to a question of actually not about the West, but about the Jews in the West that I want to come back to in a sec. Because you're a person of British origin, now living in Israel. I'm a person of American origin, now living in Israel. I know American Judaism much, much better than I know British Judaism. And I have a hunch that there's an implicit critique, not that you meant it, but I think it's at least implicit in what you're saying about what religion is and what peoplehood is about, that American Jews are going to have to rethink themselves also. But before we get to that, in just one sec, there was something that you said before that I just can't help but mention. You were talking about these young people who've gone to war out of a sense of defending their nation, and you said it's not really only just about making sure that people who live in the Gaza envelope or people who live in the north or people who live anywhere, basically, are going to be safe, but it was about something much deeper than that. And I couldn't help but remember all of these instances that you and I have both seen dozens of times in the course of the last year and a quarter, that these young people, mostly men but not only, come out of Gaza in the tanks, and they're standing outside the tank. The top isn't sealed, and they've got their fingers up in a kind of a victory thing. But what are they saying? They're saying Am Yisrael Chai. I was so blown away by that time and time again. They were sent in as soldiers of a state, and they came out talking as members of a people. And I just think that so speaks so deeply to the point that you're making. But let's come back to American Judaism for just one second. Many of the values that you're talking about that have been jettisoned, religion is not rational. Who's to tell me that this particular family structure is better than another family structure? Who's to tell me any of the things that you've been saying? A lot of American Jews, don't forget, as you well know, Orthodoxy in America is, 15%-ish, something like that. And the vast majority of American Jews are not secular like we say in Israel, but they're liberal. In other words, liberalism defines their Jewishness. Do I understand that what you're saying also, therefore, is that a huge swath of liberal Judaism is going to also have to inch its way back to Jewish sources, is going to also have to inch its way back to a Jewish conception of things, so that what's involved here is not only Judaism saving the West, but a certain segment of Jewish life and thought also saving Jewish people in the West. Is that part of the argument?
Very much so. American Jews in particular, and they're different from British Jews in this respect, have not only embraced liberal shibboleths, which are inimical to Western flourishing, inimical to Jewish values, but they've told themselves they are Jewish values. That's a great tragedy. And I think there are a number of reasons for that, why American Jews are so many American Jews are kind of primed almost against a religious sense. And they've kind of recreated Judaism in their minds to be basically liberalism. And they call it tikkun olam, which is a complete perversion, and so on and so forth. Now, they are dying out. They're going.
But they're the majority still, right?
They are absolutely the majority, but the trajectory means that they are going to take the size of the Jewish community in America is going to drastically shrink. So basically, if they want their grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren to remain Jews, and I'm not sure they do actually.
They don't care, many of them say.
Okay, that's fine. But if they do, they're going to have to restore proper Jewish values. Now, they may not want to do that, as you have implied. And that will be, it will be a bit like, what happened to the Northern Kingdom in ancient Israel, when the Northern Kingdom became the Northern Kingdom and then it vanished. They'll be like that. And then, Jews in America will be a very, very much smaller, but much more together and focused proper Jewish community.
Because it's the nucleus that will survive.
It's the nucleus that will survive. And broadly the same thing will happen in Britain, where, as I say, British Jews haven't embraced liberal shibboleths to the same degree, and certainly haven't said it's tikkun olam or anything like that. But they've it's a kind of more kind of gentle decline in which they're just assimilating, they're just letting it go. It amounts to the same thing in the end. And this is a terrible thing because not only will Jews be lost to the Jewish people as a result over time, but, and we can see this already, a number of those Jews who have so completely lost the Jewish plot have actually not just embraced liberal shibboleths, but have embraced the shibboleths which actually are hateful to Jews and to Judaism and to Israel. And they have become some of the leaders of the most vicious anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish movements in the world. And this is a terrible tragedy. I think there are signs that, there are one or two, I'm thinking of one or two conservative and reform rabbis in America who have understood. They've understood the damage. And at the moment, as far as I can see, they're like rabbits in the headlights. We've done this. We've done this. Now what? Now what? Well, the answer isn't going to be very palatable to them, but it's staring them in the face. So quite where they're going to go with that, I don't know. Quite where American Jews are going to go with that, I don't know. I mean, as we know, you've written about this, I've written about this. This last terrible year, since October 7, 2023, has changed the Jewish world in ways that we can't actually, at the moment, fully tell. But it has changed it. In all kinds of ways, and the effects are going to be with us for a very long time, both for good and ill. Right. So I don't know how it's going to go, but yes, I mean, I devote certainly a not insignificant section of the book to showing how, not just in the diaspora but also in Israel, these anti-Western destructive tendencies are undermining the Jewish people, quite apart from the West in general. And I think that's so in Israel as well, where it's a very small minority, but it's there, and it's you can hear it in people in not Jerusalem but elsewhere, saying, I just want to be a normal person. I just want to be a normal country. I want to be a country like anyone else. I want to live like anyone else in the world. I want to be a normal citizen. No, we're not. And we never will be.
Has it changed since October 7th, do you think?
What?
Here?
Has what changed?
You hear fewer people saying that? You think there are fewer people in, I don't know, let's just call it Medinat Tel Aviv,
Yes.
the state of Tel Aviv as they call it. You think there's fewer people saying that kind of universalist thing these days?
I've heard it less, but I can still see that institutionally, and I will name no names of institutions, but institutionally, it's very much there, but it's waiting. It's waiting. It's waiting because this is a national crisis like there's never been, and no one currently knows how or when it's going to end. But it's still on. And so while it's still on, there's a kind of silence. It's under the surface. You can see it erupting in certain respects, certain places, certain times over certain issues, but it's much more muted. When this is over, and will we ever know when it's over,
right.
But put that to one side, would it revert? Look, I mean, people who said, when October 7 happened and we saw this amazing spirit among the young people who went and, sacrificed their lives for Am Yisrael. People said, basically, that's it. All the divisions of the past are now over. We are now united, and we're never going to go back to, the nightmare of the judicial reform, near civil war. That's over. It's finished. Excuse me? I mean, the Jews are the most quarrelsome people on the planet, bar none. Even the Almighty couldn't stand them. The idea that the Jews of Israel are suddenly going to, be bound together is absurd.
Rubbish. That's right.
It's absurd. But will something have changed? Yes, I think it will have changed. I think it will have changed because I think that there's that generation which is currently on the battlefield, and of whom so many have died and have been maimed and all the rest of it. But that generation, which is the rising generation, and this is the great hope for Israel for the future, that generation is basically saying, never again will we make these mistakes. And the mistakes are not just mistakes of, military preparedness and the conceptia, the false idea that they had about the Hamas and all. That's all true and it has to be taken care of, and the political echelon, that's all true. But what I hear never again will we have the mindset in which we were in danger of forgetting what makes us what we are. And this is what we are, and we're going to affirm what we are, which is the connection to the past, which links the present to the future. And that is what we have to hold on to. And we're not going to undermine that. So I think that, that troublesome as these Western ideas are, we want to be the same as everybody else. I think that what's changed in Israel is the coming to the fore of this set of beliefs in younger people, which were always there, obviously, but we never knew they were there, which says basically never again, and now we know what we are, and we're going to make sure that we remain like this.
So you have a deep-seated optimism about Israel.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which I share, obviously. Do you have as deep-seated an optimism about the West? I mean, the book is a call. It's a cri de coeur. It's saying, look at what's broken. Look at what you've broken. Look at what we've broken. Look at the emptiness and the hurt and the pain and the loneliness of the lives that you've created. To say nothing of the immorality and so on and so forth. It's not too late to fix it. How optimistic are you that a generation from now, if one of my adult children and one of your adult children are to sit at this exact table, that they will say, yeah, something about 2025 and on was a turning point. So October 7th was a turning point for Israel in certain ways. Do you foresee a turning point for the West?
Well, I said in the book, October 7 was an inflection point, not just for Israel, but for the West. That was where the West was given the choice. Do you choose civilization or barbarism? And so far, they've not chosen civilization.
Right.
So this looks pretty bleak. But as I've tried to indicate, there are things under the surface, not actually very far under the surface, some of them are on the surface, this rise of populism.
Right.
These millions of people who want the West to remain what it was and fight for what it was. That gives me a great deal of optimism. The challenges, however, are hideous and formidable. It requires leadership. At the moment, one looks around and you think, well, where are the leaders who actually get this? And it's hard to find leaders who really, really get it. There are a number of leaders who get bits of it. Mm-hmm. But where are the leaders who really get it in the West? Well, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe they're there. But, okay, so it's not clear how this is going to happen. But I do think, you say, what do I see when I think about, future generations at this table? I can't tell you. I really can't tell you. I think, as I say, this is a moment of choice. The West is kind of it's teetering on the edge of the cultural cliff, and it's already crumbling. It's already crumbling. The boulder's already falling, but it hasn't yet completely collapsed. And do cultures commit suicide? Well, ancient Rome and ancient Greece went the way that they did, and no one at that time would have ever foreseen that would have happened, but it did. And so it's perfectly possible that the West will go the same way. And you have, again, we haven't mentioned it, but in my book, in not just in the wings, but in the West already, predatory Islamism, right. Which sees the weakness. It sees the weakness, understands the weakness better than the West understands it, and is already moving in to take over. Could that happen? It could. But everything is to play for. If there are leaders who really get it and can mobilize all those millions who get it, the tools are there. They have it in their own culture. And, Jewish people can help with that in the ways that I've been talking about. Will they take that opportunity? I don't know. I don't think anyone can say. All I can say is what I've said in the book. It's a choice. I hope they make the right choice. If they don't, it's over. But it's not over till it's over. There are people who are so pessimistic and say we've gone too far, we can't, everything's unraveled to the extent we can't possibly repair it. I don't think that. I think it can be put back again. I think that the level of neediness and the level of understanding in the populations at large in the West is very great. And that is the way in which, you can see what I've called a countercultural resistance movement, which I've said in the book. I've laid out 10 kind of ways in which this resistance movement should move forward. it's there. You can see how it could happen with the right leadership. So I can't really give you an answer to the question, but everything is to play for.
You know, when I was reading the book not that long ago, the same day that I was reading, over the few days that I was reading the book, one of the days was a day that when we were doing Daf Yomi, the daily page of Talmud, which was then in the beginning of the Tractate of Sanhedrin, it just happened to mention coincidentally that exactly same day that if there is a court addressing a capital case, and the 71 people come back unanimously and convict the person, Talmud says the person goes free.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
if it's unanimous,
Yes. It must be something wrong.
there was no serious conversation.
Yes.
And that's where the book is so important. The book is to promote conversation. It's precisely to be the opposing voice that is so critical. And as you say, everything's to play for, and the tools are there. And I think that one of the great additions to the toolbox is this new wonderful book, The Builder's Stone, How Jews and Christians Built the West and Why Only They Can Save It. And I would go so far to say is probably why only Melanie Phillips could have written this book. So for all that you've taught us and will teach the people who are going to read the book as a result of this conversation and many others that you'll do, thank you for writing it. Thank you for sharing your ideas. And all of us wish you tremendous success with the publication of the book.
Thank you. You're very kind, and I'm so very gratified and grateful that it had such an effect on you and that you've got it so completely. Thank you.